Picture this. It is December 1944. The temperature has plummeted to a bone-chilling 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and you are standing in a frozen foxhole in a Belgian forest. You are out of winter gear, out of food, and critically low on ammunition. Surrounding you are 5 fully mechanized German Panzer divisions, equipped with some of the heaviest, most lethal armor the world has ever seen. The enemy commander sends a formal written ultimatum demanding your immediate and unconditional surrender to save your men from total annihilation. Your acting commander reads the note, scoffs, and sends back a single one-word reply that will echo through military history forever. Nuts. Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the Hollywood myths and dissect the brutal, cold, and calculated realities of military history. If you want to understand how wars are actually fought and won, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and drop a comment below, letting me know which desperate last stand in history you think required the most tactical brilliance. Today, we are tearing into the Battle of the Bulge, specifically the Siege of Bastogne, where the US 101st Airborne Division, a light infantry unit, managed to halt a massive German armored juggernaut dead in its tracks. To understand how a single airborne division ended up acting as a speed bump that broke the axle of the German war machine, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic nightmare that was the Western Front in late 1944. The roots of this offensive stretch back decades, deeply embedded in German military doctrine. Ever since the failure of the Schlieffen Plan in World War I, German strategists obsessed over rapid, decisive victories to avoid a protracted two-front war of attrition. The Ardennes forest, a dense, heavily wooded and rugged region stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg, was long considered by traditional military minds to be completely impassable for heavy armor. But the Germans knew better. In 1940, General Heinz Guderian drove his Panzer Corps right through the Ardennes, bypassing the Maginot Line, shattering the French army, and pushing the British into the sea at Dunkirk. Fast forward to late 1944, and Adolf Hitler, staring down the barrel of total defeat with the Soviets closing in from the east and the Americans and British pushing from the west, decided to play his favorite card one last time. Operation Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was born out of sheer strategic desperation. The objective was wildly ambitious. 3 German armies were to punch through the thinly defended Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and capture the crucial Belgian port city of Antwerp. Why attack through the Ardennes again, and why Antwerp? The answer, as it always is in warfare, is logistics. By the winter of 1944, the Allied supply lines were stretched to the absolute breaking point. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system of thousands of trucks running day and night, had burned out its vehicles and exhausted its drivers, trying to keep frontline units supplied with gasoline, rations and ammunition from ports in Normandy. Taking Antwerp, a massive deep-water port close to the front lines, was supposed to solve the Allied logistical crisis. Hitler knew that if he could capture Antwerp, he would not only sever the Allied supply chain, but also split the British and American armies in two, potentially forcing a negotiated peace on the Western Front. It was a massive gamble, a roll of the dice relying heavily on complete surprise and terrible weather. And for a brief moment, the gamble paid off. How did Allied intelligence fail so spectacularly to see a massive build-up of hundreds of thousands of German troops and thousands of tanks? The answer is a toxic cocktail of arrogance, complacency, and terrible weather. The Allies believed the German army was a spent force, incapable of mounting a strategic offensive. The Ardennes was treated as a ghost front, a quiet sector where exhausted American divisions like the 28th Infantry Division, which had been chewed up in the Hurtgen forest, were sent to rest, and where green, untested units like the 106th Infantry Division were sent to get their feet wet. Furthermore, heavy cloud cover and freezing fog grounded Allied reconnaissance planes. If you cannot see the enemy and you do not believe the enemy has the capacity to attack, you are setting yourself up for a catastrophic tactical surprise. This brings us to a crucial historical comparison. The situation the Americans were about to face was eerily similar to the Continental Army at Valley Forge, but with the added horror of incoming 88mm artillery shells. Just like George Washington's men, the American soldiers in the Ardennes were entirely unprepared for the brutal winter conditions. Many were still wearing summer combat uniforms. Trench foot became a massive casualty producer before the shooting even started. But unlike Valley Forge, the Americans at Bastogne were not just trying to survive the winter, they were holding a strategic linchpin. Think of the Battle of Gettysburg and the desperate defense of Little Round Top, or the vital road junctions in that Pennsylvania town. Bastogne was exactly that. It was a hub where 7 primary roads converged in the middle of the dense Ardennes forest. In a heavily mechanized war, tanks and supply trucks cannot simply drive through dense pine forests and deep snow. They need roads. If the Americans held Bastogne, the German armoured spearheads would be forced into massive traffic jams on muddy, secondary logging trails, bleeding precious time and fuel. Let us look at the brutal mathematics of the force comparison, starting with the German war machine. The assault on Bastogne was spearheaded by the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, a brilliant and aggressive armour tactician. The specific element tasked with taking Bastogne was the 47th Panzer Corps, under the command of General Heinrich Freiherr von Lüttwitz. Lüttwitz had at his disposal a terrifying array of combat power, including the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadiers Division. The Panzer Lehr Division was an elite unit, originally formed from armoured demonstration and training troops, meaning its personnel were highly experienced veterans. The spearhead of these German armoured columns relied heavily on the Panzerkampfwagen 5, better known as the Panther tank. The Panther Ausf G was a 45-ton monster, armed with a high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun that could punch through the frontal armour of an American Sherman tank from over a mile away. Its thick, sloped frontal armour made it nearly impervious to standard Allied anti-tank fire. Behind the Panthers lumbered the terrifying Tiger II, or King Tiger, weighing in at nearly 70 tons, with an 88mm main gun. On paper, this force was an unstoppable armoured fist. But does industrial might and heavy armour always guarantee a swift victory on the battlefield? Not if your logistical tail is severed and your industrial base is crumbling. By late 1944, Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, had managed to perform miracles by moving factories underground to avoid Allied strategic bombing. But the German defense industrial base was fundamentally broken. Germany could build a King Tiger, but they could not build enough heavy trucks to supply it, nor could they refine enough synthetic fuel to keep its massive Maybach V12 engine running. The German offensive was literally running on fumes. Lüttwitz's panzer divisions were operating under strict orders to capture American fuel dumps to sustain their advance. They were a heavyweight boxer with a glass jaw, capable of a devastating knockout punch, but completely lacking the stamina for a long fight. On the other side of the ledger, we have the American defenders, primarily the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Airborne doctrine in the United States military was built around vertical envelopment. Paratroopers were elite, highly motivated light infantry, designed to drop behind enemy lines, secure key objectives, and hold out for a few days until heavily armored conventional forces could relieve them. They were not designed, equipped, or intended to stand toe-to-toe with heavy panzer divisions in a protracted siege. When the German offensive kicked off on December 16th, the 101st was actually resting and refitting at Camp Montmelon in France, recovering from heavy losses sustained during Operation Market Garden. Their legendary commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was away in Washington, D.C., attending a conference. Command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander. The American paratrooper was arguably the finest light infantryman in the world at that time. While the German Volksgrenadiers were largely armed with the bolt-action Karabiner 98K, the American infantryman carried the M1 Garand. The Garand was a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle that gave the American squad a massive advantage in sheer volume of fire. General George S. Patton famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But volume of rifle fire does not stop a 45-ton Panther tank. The 101st was critically deficient in anti-tank capabilities. Their primary anti-armor weapon was the M1A1 bazooka, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that was practically useless against the frontal armor of a Panther or a Tiger. To get a kill, a bazooka team had to hide in the freezing brush, let the tank roll past them, and fire into the thinner side or rear armor, a tactic that required nerves of absolute steel. Their organic artillery consisted of 75mm pack howitzers, designed to be broken down and dropped by parachute. These guns were excellent for infantry support, but lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate heavy German armor. They did have a handful of towed 57mm anti-tank guns, but against a Panther, these were often referred to as simply door knockers. So, what happens when an unstoppable armored force hits a lightly armed airborne division lacking winter clothing and heavy weapons? You get a masterclass in defensive terrain utilization and sheer, stubborn violence of action. The American industrial base, centered in places like Detroit's Arsenal of Democracy, was churning out thousands of M4 Sherman tanks, millions of rounds of ammunition, and endless fleets of 2.5-ton trucks. The U.S. replacement system, while flawed in how it fed individual soldiers into meat grinder units, ensured that the overall American war machine could absorb massive losses and keep fighting. But none of that industrial might mattered to the men of the 101st on the night of December 17th. They were abruptly shoved into the backs of open canvas trucks, headlights off, driving through the freezing, pitch-black night toward a small Belgian crossroads town they had never heard of. They were racing against time, trying to beat Lüttwitz's panzers to the vital intersection of Bastogne. The German artillery was already chewing up the forward American lines. The weather was keeping the P-47 Thunderbolts grounded, and the screaming Eagles were driving straight into a steel trap that was rapidly closing around them. The moment the trucks of the 101st Airborne ground to a halt in the freezing mud of Bastogne on December 18th, the paratroopers did not walk into a fortified citadel. They walked into a chaotic, terrified town, clogged with retreating American stragglers and fleeing civilians. The German armored spearheads were only a few miles away, chewing through the last desperate American roadblocks. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had hours, perhaps only minutes, to form a defensive perimeter before the full weight of the 5th Panzer Army crashed down on his completely exposed light infantry. To buy that precious time, he needed heavy metal, and he found it in Colonel William Roberts and Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division. Roberts was a seasoned armour officer who understood that sending his tanks out to fight a pitched battle against superior German numbers in the open was suicide. Instead, he shattered his combat command into 3 heavily armed, highly mobile task forces, designated Team Cherry, Team O'Hara, and Team de Sobry. These teams were pushed out to the small satellite villages surrounding Bastogne to act as heavily armoured speed bumps. Let us zero in on Team de Sobry at the village of Neuville, located just north of Bastogne, because this is where the brutal reality of armoured warfare in the Ardennes was forged in blood. Commanded by Major William de Sobry, a 26-year-old officer, this scratch force consisted of just 15 M4 Sherman tanks, a few half-tracks, and a handful of armoured infantry. Rolling out of the freezing fog to meet them was the vanguard of the German 2nd Panzer Division, a unit fielding over 100 tanks, including the terrifying Mark V Panthers. How exactly do you hold off a force that outguns and outnumbers you 10 to 1? You use the environment as your equalizer. The dense, freezing fog reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. In a wide open field, a Panther could destroy a Sherman from a mile away with its high-velocity 75mm gun, while the Sherman's standard 75mm round would merely bounce off the Panther's thick, sloped frontal glacis plate. But in the fog-choked, narrow streets of Neuville, engagement ranges were reduced to point-blank street brawls. At 50 yards, the Sherman's faster turret traverse speed and the gyroscopic stabilizer on its main gun allowed the American crews to get off the first shot, aiming for the thinner side armor or the tracks of the German behemoths. It was a vicious, chaotic knife fight in the snow. Just as William B. Travis and his men held the walls of the Alamo to buy Sam Houston time to build an army, Team de Sobry, soon reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, bled the Germans for 2 agonizing days. They fought from house to house, using bazookas from second-story windows and calling in artillery on their own positions. By the time the fog briefly lifted on December 19th, revealing a terrifying sea of German armour surrounding the village, Major de Sobry had been severely wounded and captured, and his task force was nearly annihilated. But their sacrifice was not in vain. They had stalled the 2nd Panzer Division for 48 hours, giving McAuliffe the time he desperately needed to draw a ring of steel around Bastogne. That ring of steel was a masterclass in defensive geometry. McAuliffe deployed his regiments like the spokes of a wagon wheel. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held the north, the 506th held the east, the 501st held the southeast, and the often overlooked 327th Glider Infantry Regiment was stretched dangerously thin to cover the massive southern and western flanks. By December 20th, the trap snapped completely shut. The last road out of Bastogne was cut by the Panzer Lehr Division. The 101st Airborne, along with elements of the 10th Armoured and remnants of the 9th Armoured, were completely surrounded. They were trapped in a pocket roughly 16 miles in circumference. Why is being surrounded sometimes a tactical advantage for a highly disciplined force? The answer lies in the concept of interior lines of communication.
Think back to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, where Union General George Meade utilized the fishhook shape of Cemetery Ridge to rapidly shift his reserve troops back and forth to plug gaps in his line. McAuliffe did the exact same thing at Bastogne. Because he controlled the town at the center of the circle, he could move a company of paratroopers or a platoon of Sherman tanks from the northern sector to the southern sector in less than 30 minutes using the town's paved roads. The German commanders, on the other hand, were operating on exterior lines. If General von Lüttwitz wanted to shift a panzer battalion from the north to support an attack in the south, his tanks had to burn precious fuel and navigate miles of muddy, snow-clogged logging trails around the outside of the American perimeter, a process that took hours, if not an entire day. But mobility means nothing if you cannot stop the enemy's infantry, and this is where the American artillery proved to be the ultimate grim reaper of the Ardennes. General McAuliffe was, by trade, an artilleryman, and he centralized the fire control of every single gun inside the pocket. He had the 101st Organic 75mm pack howitzers, but more importantly, he had the heavy 105mm and 155mm guns of the 420th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion and other stranded artillery units. They implemented a devastating tactic known as time on target, or TOT. In traditional artillery fire, guns fire as they are loaded, resulting in a staggered bombardment that gives enemy infantry time to dive into foxholes after the first shell hits. In a TOT mission, the Fire Direction Center calculates the exact flight time of a shell from every single battery in the perimeter. The guns are then fired at precisely staggered intervals, so that every single high-explosive shell from every single cannon arrives on the target at the exact same millisecond. When the German Volksgrenadiers formed up in the tree lines to launch an assault, they were not met with a warning shot. They were instantly vaporized by a synchronized wall of high explosives. To make matters exponentially worse for the attackers, the Americans began utilizing top-secret POSIT, or VT, proximity fuses. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground, a tiny radio transmitter inside the nose of the artillery shell detected when it was 50 feet above the earth and detonated the round in mid-air. When these airbursts went off in the dense canopy of the Ardennes pine forests, they turned the very trees into secondary fragmentation. Thousands of razor-sharp wooden splinters rained down on the German infantry, causing horrific casualties and completely breaking up their massed infantry assaults before they even reached the American foxholes. Despite the brilliance of the American artillery, the environment was rapidly becoming a more lethal enemy than the Germans. By December 21st, the temperature dropped to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The microenvironment of a frozen foxhole is a psychological and physical meat grinder. What happens to a human body when it sits in a hole in the freezing mud for 5 days straight without moving? The blood vessels in the feet constrict, the tissue dies, and trench foot sets in, rapidly leading to gangrene and amputation. The American paratroopers had no winter boots, no white camouflage snowsuits, and no cold-weather sleeping bags. They wrapped their boots in burlap sandbags and stuffed them with straw just to stave off the frostbite. The extreme cold also wreaked havoc on their weapons. The standard military lubricant used in the M1 Garand rifles and the M1919 Browning machine guns froze solid, turning the weapons into useless blocks of steel. American GIs were forced to urinate on the operating rods of their rifles just to thaw the frozen grease so they could manually cycle around into the chamber when the Germans attacked. Inside the town, the logistical and medical situation had devolved into an absolute nightmare. The 101st Divisional Medical Company had been captured by the Germans on the very first day of the siege. The remaining battalion surgeons, like Dr. Jack Pryor, were operating in the freezing basements of ruined stone houses. There was no electricity, no running water, and critically, no penicillin and no blood plasma. The plasma they did have had frozen solid in its glass bottles, rendering it useless. Surgeons were forced to perform amputations using unsterilized instruments, giving wounded men a shot of scavenged cognac to bite down on the pain.
Ammunition was heavily rationed. The artillery batteries were restricted to firing only 10 rounds per gun per day, unless they were firing on a massed infantry assault. The paratroopers in the foxholes were down to their last few clips of rifle ammunition. They were starving, freezing, and completely cut off from the rest of the Allied armies. General Hasso von Manteuffel and General von Lüttwitz knew exactly how desperate the American situation was. The German 5th Panzer Army was bleeding time it did not have. The grand strategic objective of Antwerp was slipping away with every hour the Americans held the Bastogne Crossroads. Hitler's strict timetable was completely shattered. Lüttwitz decided it was time to end the siege through psychological pressure. He believed that the Americans, battered, freezing, and out of ammunition, would see reason and surrender to avoid a total massacre. On the morning of December 22nd, the freezing fog was thicker than ever, blanketing the scarred, cratered landscape in an eerie, dead silence. Down the road from the town of Ardennes, stepping carefully through the snow and the shattered pine trees, a small party of German officers emerged from the white mist, carrying a large white flag of truce. The blindfolded German emissaries, led by a major acting on behalf of General von Lüttwitz, were carefully guided through the shattered American lines and brought to the command post of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. They carried a formal, typewritten ultimatum that was as arrogant as it was chilling. The document demanded the honourable surrender of the encircled town within 2 hours, explicitly threatening that if the Americans refused, the German artillery would obliterate Bastogne, resulting in massive civilian casualties. The message was rushed to the underground bunker, where Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had just been woken from a rare, exhausted sleep. When the ultimatum was translated for him, McAuliffe, still half asleep and entirely unimpressed, muttered, "Nuts," when his staff reminded him that he actually had to provide a formal written reply to the German commander. McAuliffe was momentarily stumped on how to phrase his rejection. Colonel Harry Kinnard, his operations officer, spoke up and suggested that his initial instinctive reaction was absolutely perfect. A piece of paper was rolled into a typewriter, and the official response was drafted. It read, "To the German commander, nuts from the American commander." Colonel Joseph Harper, the commander of the 327th, was tasked with delivering this message back to the waiting German officers. When the German major read the single word, he was utterly bewildered, asking Harper if the reply was affirmative or negative. Harper, staring down the enemy officer, bluntly clarified that in plain English it meant, "Go to hell." Why is this seemingly minor exchange of words so critical to the anatomy of the battle? In warfare, psychological dominance is just as lethal as high explosives. By dismissing a vastly superior armoured force with a single word of street slang, McAuliffe completely inverted the psychological dynamic of the siege. He signalled to the Germans that the Americans were not terrified victims waiting to be slaughtered, but dangerous predators holding their ground. More importantly, when the word of the reply spread through the frozen foxholes of the American perimeter, it acted as a massive adrenaline injection for the freezing, starving paratroopers. It was a masterstroke of combat leadership. But bravado does not stop tank shells, and by the evening of December 22nd, the 101st Airborne was down to its last few pallets of ammunition and medical supplies. They needed a miracle. And on the morning of December 23rd, that miracle arrived in the form of a massive Russian high-pressure weather system. The freezing fog that had grounded Allied air power for a week was suddenly blown away, revealing a brilliant, cloudless, ice-blue sky. And with clear skies came the full, unadulterated wrath of the United States Army Air Forces. The logistical lifeline was instantly re-established by the unsung heroes of the Troop Carrier Command. 241 C-47 Skytrain transport planes roared over the Ardennes, braving intense German anti-aircraft fire to drop 144 tons of critically needed supplies directly into the tiny Bastogne perimeter. Colored parachutes carrying artillery shells, K-rations, penicillin, and blankets blanketed the snow. But the C-47s only brought survival. The instrument of German destruction arrived shortly after, in the form of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a massive, heavily armored fighter bomber, affectionately known as the Jug. It was powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine and armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns. But its true tank-killing capability lay under its wings, where it carried 500-pound bombs and 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, or HVARs. When a flight of P-47s rolled in on a German armored column trapped on a narrow forest road, the results were apocalyptic. The rockets did not always need to penetrate the heavy frontal armor of a Panther tank to destroy it. A near miss from a high-explosive rocket would shatter the tank's optical sights, blow off its tracks, and completely deafen the crew, rendering the vehicle a useless, immobile pillbox. The Thunderbolts turned the roads leading to Bastogne into burning graveyards of German armor and logistical trucks. General Hasso von Manteuffel knew his window was slamming shut. With the skies clear, his panzer divisions were being hunted from the air, and his timetable was entirely ruined. In a desperate bid to crush the Bastogne pocket once and for all, he ordered a massive, coordinated assault for Christmas Day. At 0300 hours on December 25th, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by elements of the 77th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, launched a brutal night attack against the western perimeter, hitting the stretched lines of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment near the village of Champs. In the freezing darkness, German Mark IV tanks and white-clad infantry actually managed to punch through the American lines, penetrating deep into the rear areas of the perimeter. How do you stop a mechanized breakthrough when your infantry lines have been ruptured? You deploy your mobile tank destroyers, and you fight a ruthless, close-quarters brawl. The Americans unleashed the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the M18 Hellcat. The Hellcat was the exact opposite of the German heavy tanks. It had paper-thin armor, but it was incredibly fast, capable of hitting 55 miles per hour, and it mounted a lethal 76mm gun. The Hellcats played a deadly game of cat and mouse inside the American perimeter, using their speed to flank the German armor and put rounds into their vulnerable side plating. Meanwhile, every available American, including cooks, clerks, and mechanics, picked up M1 Garand rifles and bazookas to hunt down the German infantry that had infiltrated the woods. By the afternoon of Christmas Day, the German assault had been completely annihilated. Every single German tank that had breached the perimeter was left burning in the snow. While the 101st was holding the line in the north, one of the greatest logistical and strategic maneuvers in military history was unfolding to the south. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had promised General Dwight D. Eisenhower that he could attack the southern flank of the German Bulge in just 48 hours. The other Allied commanders thought Patton was boasting, but he had already ordered his staff to draft 3 separate contingency plans before the meeting even started. To understand the magnitude of this, Imagine a high-speed convoy of 250,000 men and 70,000 vehicles, heavily engaged in combat in the Saar Basin, suddenly disengaging, turning 90 degrees to the north, and driving over icy, snow-covered roads in the dead of winter to launch a massive counterattack. It is a logistical feat comparable only to General Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook armoured redeployment during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, but executed with 1940s technology and without the luxury of air superiority during the initial movement. The spearhead of Patton's relief force was the 4th Armoured Division, specifically Combat Command R, led by a ruthless and brilliant young tank officer named Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the future namesake of the M1 Abrams main battle tank. Abrams knew that a slow, methodical advance would be chewed up by the German anti-tank screens. His strategy was sheer, unrelenting violence of action. On December 26th, Abrams ordered his 37th Tank Battalion to punch straight through the German lines at the village of Assenois, just south of Bastogne. The lead tank of this assault was an M4A3E2 Sherman variant known as the Jumbo, named Cobra King. The Jumbo was specifically designed to lead assaults. It had massive amounts of extra armour welded to its hull and turret, boasting up to 7 inches of steel on the gun mantlet, allowing it to absorb hits that would instantly vaporize a standard Sherman. Firing its 75mm gun on the move and crushing German defences under its tracks, Cobra King smashed through the encirclement. At 16:50 hours on December 26th, the crew of Cobra King made contact with the engineers of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. The paratroopers, maintaining their legendary swagger to the bitter end, simply looked at the armoured crews and stated that they did not need to be rescued. They had the situation entirely under control. To truly grasp the failure of the German offensive, we must step back from the tactical violence and examine the multidimensional failures in logistics, intelligence, and grand strategy. The entire German battle plan was predicated on capturing American fuel dumps to keep their panzers running. They came agonizingly close. Just a few miles from the German advance at Stavelot sat a massive American fuel depot containing over 2.1 million gallons of 80-octane aviation gasoline. A small detachment of Belgian soldiers and American engineers prevented the capture of this strategic prize by pouring a few hundred gallons of fuel into a deep trench and setting it on fire. The advancing German Kampfgruppe, seeing a massive wall of flames, assumed the entire dump was burning and turned their tanks around. If the Germans had captured that fuel, the 1st SS Panzer Division might have actually reached the Meuse River. The economic reality was that the United States could replace every single Sherman tank lost in the Ardennes within a matter of weeks, shipped straight from the factories of Detroit. Germany, its industrial base pounded to rubble by strategic bombers, could not replace a single lost Panther or Tiger. From an intelligence perspective, the Battle of the Bulge represents one of the most catastrophic failures of the war. How did the Allies miss a build-up of nearly 500,000 men? The Allies had grown dangerously reliant on Ultra, the decryption of the German Enigma machine codes. Because they were reading German radio traffic, they assumed they knew everything. But the Germans, anticipating this, implemented strict radio silence before the offensive. They moved troops entirely at night, utilized the Reichsbahn railway network, and relied exclusively on hardwired telephone lines for communication. The Allies fell victim to technological hubris. This is a direct historical parallel to the intelligence failure during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. In both cases, American commanders relied heavily on quantitative data and signals intelligence, leading them to falsely conclude that a heavily attrited enemy was entirely incapable of launching a massive, coordinated, multi-division offensive. When you stop looking with your own eyes and only trust the machines, you invite tactical disaster. Politically, the Battle of the Bulge severely strained the Allied coalition. When the German offensive split the American forces, General Eisenhower made the highly controversial decision to transfer command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, located on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. American generals, particularly Omar Bradley and George Patton, were absolutely furious, viewing it as a massive insult to American military competence. Montgomery did not help matters by holding a press conference where he seemingly took sole credit for saving the Americans from total destruction. It required all of Eisenhower's masterful diplomatic skills to prevent the Allied High Command from fracturing entirely. It is a stark reminder that in coalition warfare, managing the massive egos of Allied generals is often just as difficult as defeating the enemy on the battlefield. The ultimate strategic lesson of Bastogne is the absolute necessity of combined arms and air supremacy. You cannot hold ground without infantry, but light infantry cannot survive a mechanized siege without overwhelming artillery and air support. Bastogne served as the direct tactical blueprint for the siege of Khe Sanh in 1968. Just as the 101st Airborne was surrounded by Panzer divisions in the snow, the U.S. Marines at Khe Sanh were surrounded by North Vietnamese Army divisions in the jungle. In both sieges, the defenders survived by holding a tightly fortified perimeter, centralizing their artillery fire to break up massed infantry assaults, and relying entirely on a massive aerial resupply bridge, while tactical air power ground the besieging enemy to dust. Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes was a spectacular strategic suicide. By throwing his last remaining panzer reserves, his veteran infantry, and his final operational fighter squadrons into the meat grinder of the Bulge, he completely hollowed out the defense of the Third Reich. When the Soviets launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive in the east just a few weeks later, the German lines shattered instantly, because the armor that was supposed to defend Berlin was left burning in the snowy forests of Belgium. The 101st Airborne Division, battered, freezing, but entirely unbroken, had driven a stake through the heart of the German war machine. War is rarely decided by the theoretical perfection of a battle plan. It is decided by the brutal, agonizing friction of logistics, weather, and the sheer, stubborn refusal of the individual soldier to yield his ground. When the unstoppable force of German armor met the immovable object of American airborne infantry, it was the heavy metal that broke. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Which factor do you believe was the most critical in saving Bastogne from total destruction? Was it A, the centralized and devastating use of American artillery? Was it B, the clearing of the weather, allowing for massive aerial resupply and close air support? Or was it C, the rapid and unprecedented logistical redeployment of Patton's Third Army? Drop your answer in the comments, and I will see you on the next battlefield.